It seems settled. I'll get started. I'm Adam Klein. I'm the manager of the SFO branch of the V8 team, and I'm also our lead on standard stuff. And I want to talk today about what we've been doing over the last couple years with regard to the language in V8 and in the features we've been adding to JavaScript and the capabilities we've been giving developers and to the platform. And for the audience today, I kind of want to focus on what this means for Blink, what this means for web APIs. So just a little bit of context. If you're a hardcore JavaScript developer, this is not going to blow your mind, I don't think. So ECMAScript 2015, what's that? Previously, this was mostly known as ES6. It's a huge addition to the JavaScript language, version 6 of ECMAScript. The reason for the renaming to a yearly method is that the spec is now being released yearly. There's actually an ECMAScript 2016. And V8 has been adding support for the features in ECMAScript incrementally for the last several years. And as of Chromium M52, we have everything pretty much that's in ES 2015 and 2016. And we're continuing to work incrementally forward. This has also been happening in other JavaScript engines around the ecosystem. So SpiderMonkey and Firefox, Chakra and Edge, and JavaScript Core and Safari all have pretty good support at this point for ES 2015. It's already in pretty broad use by web developers through transpilers like Babel and TypeScript, but we're also hoping that once we have this suite of different engines all supporting it, that developers on the web who are targeting modern browsers can really just focus on shipping this thing without transpiling. So I wanted to do go through a few features that I think are particularly interesting to the web APIs part of this. But again, this is not going to be some big tour of all the features of the language, and in particular, it's just going to touch on a few things here and there. So don't expect that I'm going to go do a full DevRel explanation of how to use all these things. Also, I'm not in DevRel, and I'm not a JavaScript programmer, so my examples may be somewhat less awesome than they would be otherwise. But before we actually get into what's in ES 2015, I wanted to do a little bit of discussion of why are we doing this? Why are we adding stuff to the language? What's wrong? Why can't JavaScript just be JavaScript? So let's look back at what we had in ES5, the previous version. And it's a version that's been supported pretty much by all the browsers. I mean, later versions of IE also support most things in ES5. So say you want to define a class. So of course, what you say is function, my class, OK. So this is your constructor. And then there's some constructor code to set up your instance state. It's kind of reasonable. I don't know about that function keyword, but you explain to someone, OK, so it's a function, and that's how it works. But this isn't quite a class yet. It's just a struct. So how do we add some methods? OK, so now you explain, well, there's this prototype thing and the prototypical inheritance. And so, yeah, you just say .prototype, method name, there's function. OK, that's kind of reasonable. Functions and methods that are pretty much the same thing. So people will be happy with that. And then this accesses that instance state using this dot. So, we had to explain a few things to the developer here, but it wasn't too bad. Classes are functions, OK, and class hierarchy is prototype based. So what if we wanted to subclass this? OK, so I've got my subclass. Again, it's a function. I take another argument here. And the first thing you do in most languages when you're calling the superclass is when you're making a subclass, is to call the superclass. And so there's something funny about this, though. We're not just calling this function. We're using this .call method. So functions have a .call method, which they use to set the receiver, the this, in the function. And that's something you then have to explain to someone. What does .call do? What does .apply? How does those compare? And it's also kind of funny. You have a function that's a class, and you have to call a function on it to call it. This is, OK. But again, here we haven't actually made a class yet. This is just another constructor that's calling this constructor. So we need to actually build up some hierarchy here. How do we make this a subclass? OK, now we're doing back this prototype thing, but now there's another concept we have to introduce, this object.create, which creates an object with the prototype chain appropriately. Okay, that's, so now you have two kinds of prototypes we're already thinking about. There's this object that has the prototype, and there's the prototype property. Okay, let's keep going and see where we get. So let's override a method on our superclass. So again, we assign it to the prototype, and in this method, we just log that we got called from the subclass, and then we want to delegate the actual behavior to our superclass. So now we have to know about the prototype thing to walk up there, and we use the .call thing again to pass this along. And we're like, okay, so now we've had to explain this function as a class. We have to explain .call. We have to explain object create. And we have a lot of stuff here. Oh, I forgot something, actually. We need to make sure that the constructor property is set up because people are going to expect that happens. And it's just a lot of bookkeeping you have to do. So in truth, most people are not going to write all this every time they want to write a class. They're going to use some framework that does this for them. But that has a couple of disadvantages. One is you have to actually download the framework and run it every time you want to define a class, which is, that's not perfect for where we want to get with the web. But also, two different frameworks may do slightly different things. They might have different features. One may provide some shortcut to make the prototype method call thing nicer, or one may forget to set the constructor property, and then other code that expects that to be there will be surprised. So you can get some interoperability problems between different frameworks just by using whatever they think is a class hierarchy. So what about ES 2015? That's what we're here to talk about. So how do you define a class in ES 2015? Well, you've got to use the class keyword. That's one step forward. This isn't any different amount of code, really, than the first version. But it seems a little bit more straightforward. You say, here's my constructor. You set up your state. You have a method. You can interact with this there. And one of the nice things I think about this just by itself is we cut out some boilerplate. You don't have to say function like several times. We can tell syntactically these are methods. The constructor is sort of a method. And it's just pretty clean. And so what about subclassing? How does that work? So you use the extends clause on class. So this works kind of like you might expect. And then your constructor, okay, again, you usually want to call your superclass. And how does that work here? We have this super keyword, which we can invoke to get the super constructor to run to get everything set up correctly for the subclass and the superclass. So that's nice that we didn't have to learn about .call. We just said, okay, super is the thing you have to put here. In fact, if you forget to put super there, the system will complain. And then we do some setup of our other stuff, and then you see our method down here. And again, you see actually the use of super. And this is a slightly different use, but again, it's for the same purpose. You want to delegate to your parent class, and the super keyword here lets you start your lookup at your parent class instead of starting at you. So I think this is definitely an advantage. And back to those disadvantages of the ES5 version, this is built into the language. It's what we will explain to programmers if you write a blog post on how to make a class in JavaScript. You'll write this instead of that thing before. And so people might just use this instead of saying, well, how to make a class? Let me look for whatever framework.class, and whatever framework.extend. And then when multiple people use this, they can interact with different pieces. In fact, we're making use of that fact in the platform to mean you can actually subclass pieces of the platform. And custom elements is the big example where we're actually doing this. And so coming soon in Chrome, I'm not sure if we can do it right now, but you can, rather than just having to go through the register element song and dance, you can extend HTML element directly and then instantiate it as you might normally do. So classes. So that's one I think is a really good example because it helps getting people into the platform and saying this. You can explain the platform, you can say what's happening. Of course, under the covers, this is actually still doing much of the same machinery that the previous stuff was doing, but it's doing it correctly. Like it's doing it in a consistent way across implementations, and I think that's really valuable. So what else is there? Well, there's some nice standard library stuff you might expect when you show up to a language. You have sets. So before this, if you wanted a set, you might have used an array if your set was small enough and used index of to figure out if the item was there. But now you can use this. I mean, I feel kind of silly with this slide. It's like, it's a set API. There's not really anything to see here. And there's maps. So you might say, well, objects are maps in JavaScript, but there's all these weird things. If you use in, you end up looking in the prototype chain. If you use hasOwnProperty, that's long and kind of obnoxious. And here you're actually just telling the environment, I want to map keys to values, that's great. Another thing you get from these standard containers is the ability to standardize on an iteration protocol. So another big feature of ES 2015 is iteration. So here's that set again, and now we can loop through it for every value in the set, loop through a map with keys and values. Each container has several methods on it. So for example, if you just wanted the keys of the map, that's also supported. And this has been extended to the existing object. So you can also do this over an array. Array knows how to be looped over. And because this is extensible, users can make their own collections that are iterable. And not only that, because users can do it, well, the web can do it too. And so you can now, in Chrome, do document.querySelectorAll and loop over that, the same construct. So this really works for any kind of collection, including ones built into the platform and ones you build yourself. Thanks, Alex. What else is there? So we've got some sort of foundational features. We have some library features. A lot of people say there's a lot of syntactic sugar in ES6, in the ES 2015. But, and one of the favorite features, which I saw a lot on slides yesterday, is arrow functions. So here's the simplest example of using it. You're using the ES5 map method on arrays, but here you're passing it an arrow function instead of a function. And it just sort of encourages places where you need to have a function, which are a lot of places in JavaScript. You can do it very concisely when it's appropriate. It's especially popular among slide authors, apparently, because things fit on the screen much better. But there's also actually another advantage here. It's not purely syntactic sugar, and this is true of many of these things. Like classes have that super thing, which actually does a little bit more than just be syntax. And for arrow functions, there's an additional semantic change. This is like the one slide for JavaScript programmers, I think, because it's all about what this refers to. And especially if you ever took a callback and passed it to set timeout and then were surprised when it blew up because this was a different thing when set timeout called it than when you'd set up the callback function, that would blow up. But with arrow functions, this is captured lexically and sort of does what you might naively expect. So like I said, we're not going to cover all the features in ES 2015. There's a lot of them. It's a huge addition to the spec. Here's a bunch of them. But if you want to hear more about V8's development process and about how we went about adding all this stuff, you should check out Seth Thompson. He's probably not here. But you should check out his I/O talk, which covers a lot of the okay, how did we go about doing all this, and also has all kinds of other good stuff in it. So I put it on the beginning. We're going to go beyond ES 2015, and as I said, V8 has been incrementally adding features, and we continue to do that. But again, I'd like to motivate that going beyond. Well, we could stop here. We could say, ES 2015, that's great. It's got collections, it's got iteration. Maybe we should just build everything from there. But there's some problems to be solved in the API design world, and I want to look at that. So here's a fairly old web API at this point. I mean, it's new to some people, but the geolocation API. It takes callbacks to deal with its asynchronicity, because it's going to ask the user if it's OK, and then it's going to return whatever. And it's going to go out to the device. So this has to be async. But here, at this point, the thing to do was to provide a success callback and an error callback. And that's turned out not to be so great. After a while, you get this thing people were calling callback hell, and you have nested functions all over the place. I couldn't fit a good nested function thing on the screen. I should have found one somewhere. But so there's a lot of discussion about this and how to deal with this. And the pattern that seemed to emerge in the community was promises, and that's something that got added both to the DOM and ES6 about the same time. And so then I have promises, and we saw a lot of slides with these yesterday too. Here's Fetch, like very modern web API using promises. And it doesn't result in too much indentation because you have this chaining, and it has a nice sort of catch-all exception handling method. But it's still a lot of boilerplate. You have these function things, and you have to repeat yourself over and over. And even with arrow functions, it's not that much better. You still have this, response, like, and you have this sort of separated world. You have straight line code until you get to the promise, and then you go off into this other sort of functional looking thing. So I think this has already been mentioned by some folks in this conference so far. But what do you get next? OK, so we want a way to deal with that kind of asynchronicity. It's great to break up your work. It's great to expose APIs that don't block. Fetch doesn't have a blocking version, while XHR does. And async await lets you do that. So here is the same code, but with await instead of .then. So it looks straight line to the programmer. Response equals fetch, then get the then read the JSON out, and then we can return that. So what's actually going on here? And actually, before we get to what's going on, and you can also, instead of having that catch thing, which you have to learn about, and actually if you use the promise API naively, you might not learn about it quite right because the API is pretty complex. But you can just use the same exception handling you use anywhere else in JavaScript in here. You put a try block, you have a catch, you could have a finally. If you failed to put that try block, then the exception would have gone up and out instead of just being, if you forget to put a .catch on a promise, it just disappears into the ether. But what's actually happening here? Well, as I said, if you failed to put that try block, then the exception would have gone out. And how does it go out? Well, the return value of an async function is a promise. So when you call fetch.json, it returns immediately a promise that will be resolved when the function completes successfully. So it's built on two pieces of ES6 technology. One of them explicitly, like promises, are actually materialized here. But also, it uses the same machinery that ECMAScript generators use to be able to suspend the execution of the function when it hits those awaits, and then resume them when whatever promise was returned by the right side of the await resolves. Or if it catches, then again, that goes through that throws and onward. OK, but now I have this thing, and now I have the .then again. What am I supposed to do? Well, what you're supposed to do is you're supposed to sort of keep doing that as long as you have asyncness. So here we put that function inside, put that code inside an async function, and now we can await on the bit of code that's there. And I want to point out something about this that, the reason that I chose fetch here is because fetch is years old. There was no async await in the language. We added promises, and then now all of a sudden it can be used as if it's an async function. You see down here, update state calls fetch.json, and you might think, oh, well, async functions can call async functions in a certain way. But no, it's just about promises. Those are tied together by promises, and fetch returns a promise, and response.json returns a promise. And so it's all about that promise building block lets you build up these nice abstractions, and that's the common glue. And that means actually that any one of you who are working on web APIs, when you hear someone say, oh, why doesn't that use promises? This is one of the reasons they're asking that question, because this has been building for a while. Async await has been a thing we've wanted to add to JavaScript for a long time. And it just has finally gotten up to speed. And now that stuff we had before is automatically more awesome because it used the standard thing. And again, this is another case where the platform is exposing promises in fetch. And of course, user code is also already using promises and can do the same thing. As we see here with fetch.json, which if that was a library function, you wouldn't know that it was an async function. You'd know that it returned a promise. So where are we with async await? I said this is beyond. And async await is not in the spec yet, but it's very close. It's at stage 3, which is basically ready for implementation feedback. It's been implemented in So I'll continue here. It's likely to be part of ES 2017, partly because there is a lot of implementation work going on. It's been in Chakra for a while. It's in development in JSC. It's in development in V8. I'm not sure. No, it's also in development in SpiderMonkey. So again, this is another thing. Even though this isn't going to be in the spec until 2017, the staging process allows implementations to be able to bet on the future of the web without having to worry too much about, well, will this actually make it? Which was a problem in the ES6 days when it was one giant spec that was not done until the whole thing was done. So yeah, it's in development in V8. It should be behind the experimental JavaScript flag in a couple of weeks, so you should try that out. And then we're hoping to ship sometime in Q3. So, but we're not done yet. What else is going on? So modules are sometimes put as an asterisk when you see that ES 2015 thing. There's details about that. It's partially specified in ES 2015, but the loading mechanism was not. So the thing we were waiting on was having that specified in HTML, which is now done, and so both us and other implementers are working on implementing script type equals module, which lets you make use of this new module stuff, which is, being able to have modules as part of the language is, again, a thing that we've wanted forever, and this finally is providing a way to move forward there. And again, it's something that developers are already using with transpilers, and so I hope it will be a fairly nice transition from a transpiled world to one that's not. But I'm not going to cover modules in detail here, but there is an unconference talk right up next about that. There's this whole list of proposals at TC39 that are at various stages of doneness. And some of them are more stable than others. Some of them are more likely to see the light of day. Some ones we've been thinking about in particular are adding class fields to classes. So one of the things you may have noticed in both of my class examples is the constructor still had to just assign properties to this. So it was just putting properties on the object. First of all, they're not private. They're just public properties. Some people put like an underscore in front of them to say, oh, don't touch this. But we'd really like a way to have, private state. There are a lot of people that are going to come from Java, for example, and think that they want to have their member variables private. And there's not really a nice way to do that right now. So we'd like to add syntax and semantics for that. And there's a proposal underway. And even for public fields, that syntax is not great for a variety of reasons. People who are using things like TypeScript would like to be able to type their fields, and it just doesn't work very well if you have to put the type in the middle of the constructor. And also, if you want to do some default initialization, there's a syntactic space where you could put that in the surrounding class body. But there's a proposal for those things as well. So these are moving along at TC39. We'll see how far they get, and we're thinking of experimenting with implementing them. Async iteration is another thing that adds another kind of asynchronous. I'm not as familiar with it as some folks, so I'm not going to talk about it in detail, but there's a link here. It's definitely an interesting next thing. If you see Dominic Denicola around here, he can talk to you about it as well. And then, I would say check out the proposals. See if there's something there that looks interesting. Let me know how it could be useful to you on the web platform. One of the things I want you to take away from this is that a lot of the features I'm showing really do integrate nicely. For example, maps and sets not only provide an example of here's how you make a collection, but map-like and set-like have showed up in WebIDL that have like the same interface. And so I would love there to be better integration between those things. I'm not sure if Josh is still leading it, but I think there's a session after this about how to better move that collaboration forward, so you don't have things happening in the W3C or WetWG over here and things happening in ECMAScript over here. They should be talking to each other and seeing if there are features that can coexist well and that could help the web as a whole. I wanted to thank you all for listening. I want to thank the V8 team and V8 committers who, one of the things with language features is it's going to touch the entire engine. And so I lead a team in SF that works on parts of those features, but really everyone who's working on V8 is working on the language in some way. And that's something I want to really call out. And yeah, questions? Is there a microphone? I think it's right there. I can't hear you.
Hello? Yeah, there we go. That's a little better. So are transpilers something that everyone should be using right now? I know that there are ES6 features, or ES 2015 features, that are significantly slower in V8 than their non-ES 2015 counterparts. So, like, are transpilers a thing that we should be doing?
I mean, I think there are a lot of reasons you might want to transpile. I think TypeScript is a really good example of, I think, a good reason for transpiling. They have ideas about how to improve developer productivity using a type system that's only there at build time. But that's been a huge productivity boost for a lot of teams I've talked to. And they also do some transpilation from an ES6 style to an ES5 style. For my own interest as a developer of V8, I would prefer if people did use the features and complained loudly when they were slow, and we will fix them. I mean, if you've watched any of the talk right before this talks about language features that have been there since ES5 or earlier and were slow, but we didn't have the right channel to hear about that. So I do have one concern about transpilers, which is maybe comes up in the modules discussion, which is that there are places where they don't actually do the same thing the spec does. And that worries me in the long term, but I think the best thing there is communication between people who are writing these transpilers and the spec community and the implementers. And that's actually happening pretty regularly these days. So at the moment, I think they're good. I think you should use them if you want to.
In that case of complaining loudly, I'd like to formally register my complaint about iterators and generators. But that's all.
The good news about generators is there's a lot of work being done there to make that have a bright future.
What are the optimizations for ES6 specific code that V8 implements? Is there any design doc for that right now?
I'm not quite sure what you mean. Like, you can mix ES6 and ES5 code together.
Like ES6 specific optimizations. Let's say for arrow functions, are there any specific optimizations? Like if in this place, if I use an arrow function, it'll be better than using a normal function.
That's really going to be on a feature by feature basis. And in general, I would caution you to avoid trying to match whatever V8 does right now. I mean, maps and sets are, I think, a good example where this is something you could aim for. If you like have a set and you're using something, you're using an array as a set, or you're using an object as a set. If you use a set as a set, and then you come to us and say your set is slower than my hand rolled thing, that's something that we can make better. And we're actually, that's one of the examples that we have done some work on. So I think it's all the places where there's like a semantic meaning to the feature that can really give us more hints about what to do. If that's it, I don't know where we are in time. I think that's actually time. So I'm happy to talk afterwards. And like I said, if you want to hear about modules, come to the session after this one.